Hi everyone! Thanks for visiting my channel. If you're new here, welcome. I'm Carol, the Thrifty Chic Housewife here on YouTube, and I'm so glad that you stopped by. I share all things housewife, but today we're going to be talking about canning, and in particular we're going to be talking about canning up dried beans and the problems and issues you guys have been having with canning them up. So before we get started with that, I just want to mention, for those of you who are new or for those of you who may not know, I've recently started a Facebook group for canning called Canning with Carol and Friends. We would love to have you join us. If you would like to hang out with like-minded people and ask questions and share recipes and get encouraged, that is the place to be. So pop on over to Facebook and make sure you answer the questions, and we would love to have you join us. So just a little blurb about that. So today like I said, we're going to be talking about canning beans. I get a ton of questions all the time about canning them up. People tend to have issues with them, problems that can arise with canning them. So today I'm going to try to answer all of your questions. I did put a little blurb out on my Facebook page asking you what your questions were. I made a list of those, so hopefully I will be able to address all of those particular questions. In addition, I just want to go over some basic things about canning dried beans. The first thing that I want to talk about, and just get it out of the way, and this is controversial, and I know some of you will disagree with me, and that's okay, because I reserve the right for you to do as you choose in your kitchen, but I do feel like I need to share with you what I know to be approved and safe. Canning dried beans from a dried state is not considered a safe practice, and it is not approved by the FDA or the USDA. So I do not recommend that you can beans from a dried state. Many people like to do that because they swear that it's better texture than soaking them and then canning them. I'd rather be safe than to can something that could potentially be unsafe. The reason why I don't ever go that direction is this. All of the processing times that we have for canning beans come from tested recipes, and the way the recipes were tested is with rehydrated beans. I actually contacted someone at my local extension office to explain to me why we shouldn't can beans from a dried state, and she explained that very thing to me, that they've only been tested from a rehydrated state. So for us to assume that the processing times we have for canning dried beans would also be appropriate for beans that are dry and not rehydrated before canning them, chances are they're not going to be the same. We can't assume that a rehydrated bean is going to have the same heat penetration as a dried bean. So it's not been tested that way as far as I know, and from the information that I can tell. So it's not a good practice, it's not a safe practice, and it's not something I recommend. It's not something that I do or will ever do on my channel. So I do not recommend that you process dried beans from a dried state. I do want to mention that if you have this canning book, this is by the canning diva, Diane Devereaux. That is the method that she uses in this book. She'll give you her reasons why she thinks it's okay to do that, and that's fine. Like I said, I reserve the right for you to do as you choose in your own kitchen, but for this kitchen, we are not going to can beans from a dried state. So I don't want to get into debates about it. I've just listed my reasons why I don't do it, and I'm just going to leave that there and let you decide what's best for you. The next thing is, dried beans are a low acid food, so they must be pressure canned. You have to have a pressure canner in order to properly process dried beans. I know years and years ago, our grandparents probably canned them in a water bath canner, but it's not a safe method of preserving them, and not something that we recommend. So get yourself a pressure canner if you want to can up dried beans. Another question that I get a lot is, how many beans do I need for a canner load of beans? So the National Center of Home Food Preservation says that you need approximately 5 pounds of beans for 7 quarts. It's about 3 1/4 pounds for 9 pints, which is about 3/4 of a pound for each quart. Those are estimates. That roughly works out correctly. It's going to depend on how much liquid you add to your jar. So that's a good place to start. So we've talked about that beans should be rehydrated before canning them up. And I gave you the reason why. So the next question that I get is, what's the best way to rehydrate your beans? Well, I have found the best way to rehydrate your beans is to do a quick soak. Now you can do an overnight soak and there is nothing wrong with doing that. But in my experience, doing a quick soak produces a bean with a better texture. So to do that, you just are going to sort your beans, I always rinse my beans, sort them, make sure there aren't any rocks or anything in them. Put them in a pot of water, cover them by 2 inches, bring the pot of water to a boil for 2 minutes, and then put the lid on and let them sit for an hour. That is how you do a quick soak. Then I drain off the soaking liquid, and that's an important point I want to make. Always drain your soaking liquid. Do not use that for canning. If you use it for canning, you can end up with beans that are too starchy when you process them. So always drain your beans. I often give them another rinse. That's up to you, but at the very least, make sure you drain them. Once you soak your beans and you drain them, then they're ready for cooking. Now, the National Center of Home Food Preservation, the USDA, they recommend that you parboil your beans for 30 minutes before canning them up. I know many of you, your biggest concern is mushy beans, so if you don't want to do the 30 minutes of cooking, I recommend that you at least bring them to a boil and then process them. The reason why I think that we can get by with doing that is because if you look at the recipe from the National Center for Home Food Preservation, under the can your own soup, the instructions for that is what I just stated. You just to soak your beans, drain them, and then put fresh water on them and bring them to a boil and then can them. So that's not the instruction. When you just look up canning beans, that's not the instruction. They do recommend that you boil them for 30 minutes, but I would much rather you bring them up just to a boil to get better texture than to try to can them from a dried state. So that's my recommendation. To be honest with you, I have tried different methods, and I have different methods on my channel. If you watch all of my bean videos, I've kind of experimented with different things. Some of the recipes I've boiled for 30 minutes, some of them I've just brought up to a boil. In one of them, I did just hydrate them and use them in that state. But it's really recommended that you at least bring them up to a boil before you can them. I'm just trying to give people options to keep you from canning them from a dried state, which I'm pretty certain is not safe, and it's something that you should not do. Common issues with beans. 2 of the most common issues with beans are siphoning, which is liquid loss from your jars, and your beans being mushy. So let's start with the siphoning and absorbing liquid. Canning dried beans can be a little tricky because the amount of liquid that they absorb has to do with the age of the bean and how dry the bean is. We have no way of knowing that. When you purchase a bag of dried beans from the grocery store, you have no way of knowing how old these beans are and how dry they are. So that's one thing that contributes to them absorbing a lot of liquid in your jars. I think a lot of you who are complaining about siphoning, it's not necessarily siphoning. I think your beans are absorbing liquid in your jars as they sit. So as you're you're giving them the cool down period after you've processed them, when you look at them the next day, most of your liquid is absorbed. I don't think it's siphoning so much that you're experiencing as it is that they are just continuing to absorb liquid. This is just my experience, and this is my remedy for that. First of all, what we just talked about, make sure you rehydrate your beans. The other way to help with that is par cooking them for the 30 minutes because they're going to absorb some of that cooking liquid as they're cooking for 30 minutes. Those of you who are concerned about texture don't necessarily like that answer, but that will help with them absorbing too much liquid after the canning process and when they're sitting. The other thing that can help with that is just how many beans you put in your jar before you add liquid or sauce. Instructions for canning beans are to fill your jars with beans or peas and cooking water, leaving 1-inch headspace. I'm not going to say that that's wrong, that is right, but if you can them that way, I can guarantee you that you are going to have them absorb more liquid than you would like. So what I have found, first of all, I already talked about, I don't use the cooking liquid. So that's one thing that I do not do. I always use hot broth or hot water to can my beans in. If I parboil them, I drain all that off and I use fresh when I go to process them. Just make sure that it is hot and it's boiling, just like you would with soup. And then what I do is, say we're doing quarts, I go about 2/3 with just my beans. So just past, for the quart jar, I go just past the 2-cup mark. I go just past there with just the beans. Then I fill the jar to the 1-inch headspace. 1-inch headspace is what's correct for canning beans. Then I fill it to the 1-inch headspace with liquid. That has given me the best results for canning beans. I know several of my videos say to fill them 3/4 full, which is getting us up to like the 2.5 cup mark on a quart jar. I have found that oftentimes it's too many beans. So for the best results, I fill it to between the 2 cup and the 2.5 cup mark. The 2.5 cup mark, in my opinion, that's here, and that's about 3/4 full. So I go just between the 2.5 cup mark and the 2 cup mark, right in between there. That's about 2/3 full of beans, and then, like I said, top it off with your cooking liquid, broth, sauce, whatever you're using. That has given me the best results. And I wanted to show you several jars that I have canned up. These are my Cajun red beans. These were small red beans, and you can tell that I have a lot of liquid in these jars, but I would rather have more liquid than not enough liquid. So those beans did not absorb a ton of liquid. These are my Mexican pinto beans, and as you can tell, they've absorbed a lot more liquid. I don't have, there's just enough to cover them in the jar, so they've absorbed a lot more. So they're different beans, but I use the same method and I'm getting a different result. So these are my Chipotle black beans. And again, these absorbed even more. I do have some beans that are above my liquid, and I prefer to not have that. Black beans, I would say for sure, they tend to absorb the most liquid out of all the beans I can. So I'm really trying to be more cautious and more conscious about how much liquid I'm adding to the jar. The other question while I have these out that you guys often ask, especially with black beans, see the cloudiness that's in the jar? That's just starch. I know that's been alarming to some of you. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just starch. Here are my chili beans using the same method. You can see that there's still plenty of liquid in there. And then here are my baked beans. Many of you have canned these, and this is one that you tend to have a lot of trouble with. I still have plenty of sauce. I still have plenty of liquid. And that's because I filled it with less beans. I went just above there with my beans and then topped the rest off with sauce. And you can tell I have plenty of sauce. Now, the only bean that I have really struggled with texture is lima beans. And you can tell they get extremely mushy. The other thing that I want to add about beans that are above your liquid, they are still safe to consume. They will darken and change color over time, but they're still safe to eat. And as long as you haven't lost more than half of the liquid in your jar, it's fine. Your beans are considered shelf stable as long as your seal is intact. So that should put some of those fears to rest for you. Okay, so as you can see, different beans canned at different times absorb different amounts of liquid. And like I said, I don't know that I'm not convinced that it's the type of bean as much as it is just how dried the beans were. But definitely erring on the side of caution with the amount of beans that you're adding to a jar, in my opinion, is the best way to go. And then a few other tips on avoiding siphoning during the canning process. I've talked about this a lot on my channel. Headspace, correct headspace is really important, so make sure you carefully measure your headspace. Temperature fluctuations also cause siphoning, so make sure that when you are adjusting the heat during the canning process, you do so slowly so you don't have huge temperature fluctuations during the canning process, because that will cause siphoning issues. The other thing too is the cool down period. If it's not done slowly, that can also cause siphoning issues. So make sure that you are completely at zero pressure. You wait your 10 minutes, remove your weight. I wait 10 minutes more, remove the lid, and then let my jar sit for a little bit in the canner before I remove them. All those things will help with siphoning. The next issue that the next biggest problem you guys complain about with beans is them being mushy. I've kind of talked about that. For the least mushy beans and still being safe, I recommend to bring them up to a boil and then process them. I think the quick soak makes a difference. I think it produces the best bean. So for those of you who are soaking overnight or you're soaking for an extended period of time, I would encourage you to try a quick soak and see if you get different results with that. Okay, so to show you that my beans are not mushy, I'm gonna open a jar and show them to you. We're having Mexican night tonight, so I'm gonna open my Mexican pinto beans. And just show you. Okay, so you can see that they're soft, but they're not mushy. They still have their shape. And I have to put pressure on them to get them to break open. So yes, they're soft, but they're not mushy. I just think that they have great texture. They still have some chew to them. They're not baby food. It tastes great out of the jar. Not even warmed up. Delicious. Those are my solutions for mushy beans. I just don't recommend canning them from a dried state. I can't in good conscience recommend that you do that, even though some people like the texture better. All right, on to your questions. I'm just going to go down the list. They're not in any particular order. What type of bean is best for canning? Any dried bean is great for canning. Like I said, I've gotten great results with most. Lima beans are the only ones that I think are problematic. I haven't been able to crack the code on those. I do have some more dried ones that I picked up at the Amish store. So I am going to try to see if I can get better texture with those. But those are the only beans that I have found that do not come out good when canning them at home. A list of dried beans that are safe for canning, just as an FYI, because that's another question I got. What beans can you can? Great Northern, Pinto, Limas, Yellow Eye, Garbanzo, Navy, White Kidney, Black-Eyed Peas, Kidney beans, Cranberry beans, White beans, Pink beans, Small red beans, Black beans. Now, with yellow and green split peas, those are considered beans. I know some people think that they are lentils, but they are not. They are in fact beans, so they are on the safe for canning list. Lentils, even though they are in the legume family, there are no canning guidelines for canning just lentils. So I can't tell you that it's okay to can them. But I can tell you that there is at least one tested recipe where they are included, and that is in the Ball Blue Book of Canning, included in their 10 bean soup on page 108. So I can't say that it's unsafe to can them, but I think I would stick to a tested recipe if you want to include them. But there are no approved recipes for canning them on their own. Next question, can I add Lipton onion soup mix? I'm going to have to say no on that. I looked up the ingredients in the Lipton onion soup mix, and it does include cornstarch. And we know that to be safe, we should not add any thickeners. when we're canning. So I would say no to Lipton onion soup mix. Another question that I got that kind of goes along with that: what seasonings do you recommend for canning your beans? Any dried spice is fair game. Onions and peppers are great to add. Their canning time is covered in the amount of time that you can beans, so it's safe to add onions or peppers. And another great seasoning to use is stock or broth. That's going to add a lot more flavor than water would, especially if it's home canned stock. So those are the three things that I use. Any dried spice, onions or peppers, and stock. Those are great ways to add flavor to your beans. If you want to try a special spice blend that you get at the grocery store, just make sure you read the package, make sure it doesn't include any type of starch or flour. Some of them include flour, so make sure it doesn't include any of that. The next question was to soak or not to soak. I think I've covered that extensively. So yes, soak your beans. A quick soak works the best in my opinion. Can you can different varieties together? Yes, you can. The processing time for dried beans is the same, so it's fine to make a combo recipe. Like I said, Ball has a recipe for 10 bean soup. We talked about lentils. Just make sure, because I got the question, can I can lentils? Make sure you use a tested recipe. And then I went over that split peas are not lentils, even though a lot of people think they are. They are in fact beans. They're dried and then the outer skin is moved and then they're split. The next question was, can I can garbanzo beans or chickpeas? Yes, those are safe game for canning. Any shelled dried bean is safe for canning. What are the soaking and canning times? The soaking time we went over. Again, I prefer a quick soak. If you want to do an extended soak, you can soak them for a number of hours. I know some people soak them for days. I don't know that I would recommend that, but people do soak them for days. But if you do soak them for an extended period of time, make sure that you are changing out your water frequently. And then for your processing times, you want to be aware of this. For just canning beans, your processing time is going to be an hour and 15 minutes for pints, an hour and 30 minutes for quarts. However, the exception to that rule is going to be baked beans. If you look up baked beans on the National Center for Home Food Preservation or in the Ball canning cookbooks, they have different recipes for baked beans that have different canning times. So if you are canning baked beans, make sure you use the appropriate processing time for the recipe that you are using. The baked beans that I have on my channel, I can for the time for canning, the processing time for canning beans. The typical time for baked beans from Ball or from the National Center for Home Food Preservation is less time. But I don't recommend making up your own baked bean recipe and canning it for the lesser amount of time that's recommended for the baked beans from both Ball and the National Center for Home Food Preservation. If you are going to decrease your processing time, make sure you are using the tested recipes that they recommend for baked beans, if that makes sense. I hope I didn't lose anyone on that one. And then the next question is controversial. Can I add ham or bacon? That is the question of the year. Everyone likes to have ham or bacon added to their beans, right? I say it's controversial because the National Center for Home Food Preservation and the USDA both say that we should not can with cured meats. So heat penetration is an issue with cured meats. That's why they say not to add it. However, like with many things in canning, there are always exceptions to the rules, right? And I have found several. The Ball bean soup recipe, and I got all these recipes out of the Ball Blue Book, but I'm sure they're in others of their canning books. The Ball bean soup suggests using a ham hock or salt pork cooked for 2 hours with your beans. Then you remove the bone, shred the meat, and then add it back to your beans. The next one is Ball's split pea soup. They recommend adding 1 cup of diced cooked ham. The Ball 10 bean soup, they recommend adding 1.5 cups of diced cooked ham. The Ball Boston baked beans, they recommend adding a half a pound of salt pork, but it's cooked with the beans, so there's that. And then the National Center for Home Food Preservation adds 3/4 of an inch cube of ham, bacon, or salt pork in their baked bean recipe. So there are a number of exceptions to that blanket rule. I gave you the rule. I think you should decide for yourself if adding bacon or ham is right for you. In my baked bean video, I intentionally left out adding any meat. First of all, I wanted vegetarians or people who don't like meat to have an option. Secondly, I was trying to avoid this issue, but as time has gone on, I can't avoid that issue anymore. Now, I do have Copycat Campbell's bean and bacon soup on my channel. It is a controversial recipe, but my thought behind it was this. I used the Ball recipe for bean soup and basically used that as my guideline. I cooked the bacon so that fat wasn't an issue. In my mind, bacon is a cured meat and I cooked it, which is the same as the cured and cooked ham that they're recommending that you use for their bean soup recipe. So I'm comfortable with that recipe. It is a recipe that I made up, but I am comfortable with it for that reason. If you want to make that recipe and you are not comfortable adding the bacon, just leave the bacon out. Add it when you open a jar to eat it. That's a simple way to do it. So the meat issue, you guys, I think that's at your discretion. However, I will say this, in my video for the Cajun red beans, with Cajun beans, it's traditional to have smoked sausage added. I did not add smoked sausage to those and then can them up, and I will not because I cannot find any tested recipe that includes smoked sausage. So anytime that I take some liberties, I make sure that I have a recipe that has used those ingredients, because I don't consider myself a rogue canner. Yes, have I taken some liberties? Yes, I have with the recipe that I just explained to you. But that's my reason for feeling comfortable with it, because Ball has recipes that are extremely similar and they're using the meat, basically the same type of meat that I used, and it's about the same quantity. The approved answer is no, you should not add it to your baked beans or any of your bean recipes. Only go by tested recipes. So if there's a tested recipe that includes ham or bacon, then it's fine. The experts will recommend that we don't take liberties and make up our own. So I will leave that with you. So there you have it. There's the lowdown on beans. I hope that I adequately explained things and that you feel more comfortable with canning your beans. I hope I answered your questions, but if I didn't, if you have further questions or you need more explanation, please feel free to leave me a comment in the comment section and I will be happy to get back to you. Thanks so much for joining me today, guys. I appreciate you all so very much, and I hope that you have a great day, and I will see you next time.